Okay, picture this. It's a gorgeous sunny day on a college campus back in 1974. Students are heading to class, hanging out, just soaking up the afternoon. And then, there he is, a tall, handsome, sharply dressed guy. He's got his arm in a sling, and he's struggling to balance a big stack of books. He walks up and asks, "Hey, excuse me, could you help me out for just a second?" It is literally the most ordinary request in the world, but for dozens of young women, that simple question ended in absolutely unimaginable tragedy. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack the deeply chilling case of Ted Bundy.
So, the big question we really need to answer today is how? How does a seemingly perfect, highly educated law student manage to operate as one of America's absolute worst predators for nearly a decade? I mean, how does someone travel all across the country, confess to 30 murders, and keep in mind investigators are pretty sure there were way more, without getting caught sooner? Well, it all comes down to how expertly he manipulated society's blind spot.
Part 1. The Perfect Facade. Theodore Robert Bundy was born in 1946, and right from the start, his life was completely tangled in secrets. Basically, to avoid a family scandal, he grew up believing his grandparents were actually his parents, and that his biological mother was his older sister. Psychologists who've really dug into his case, they think finding out that massive foundational lie as a young adult really fractured something deep inside his psyche.
And the contrast here is just wild. On the surface, he was the ultimate model citizen, right? A super bright, popular psychology major at the University of Washington. He worked in local politics, even volunteered at a suicide crisis hotline. But if you look closely, the early warning signs were definitely there. Family members actually remembered finding him when he was just 3 years old, quietly placing kitchen knives around his sleeping aunt. The thing is, he was so good at blending in that he completely fooled the people working right alongside him. Ann Rule, who was actually his boss at that suicide hotline and later became a massive true crime author, famously called him the exception to everything she'd ever believed about killers. That polished, super charming exterior wasn't just a personality quirk, it was absolutely his greatest weapon. Which brings us to part 2, A Trail of Terror. That quiet, sort of unsettling background suddenly erupted into a series of horrific, confirmed attacks starting early in 1974. It picked off with 18-year-old Karen Sparks, who miraculously survived a brutal attack in her own basement but was left with permanent brain damage. And then, just a month later, 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy vanished straight from her bedroom. So how exactly was he pulling this off? Well, he definitely targeted a specific type, usually young women with long center-parted hair, but his actual methods were constantly shifting. He'd wear that fake arm sling, or he'd struggle with some heavy bags to get someone to help him. Sometimes he'd even straight up impersonate a police officer. It was all about exploiting basic human kindness and making sure he looked 100% harmless. And this is where his absolute brazenness really hits a terrifying peak. July 1974, Lake Sammamish State Park. He managed to abduct 2 different women, Janice Ott and Denise Nosland, on the exact same Sunday afternoon, in broad daylight, surrounded by literally hundreds of people. Dozens of witnesses remembered seeing a nice guy with his arm in a sling asking for a hand. He was so confident, he was actually introducing himself to people simply as Ted. From there, things escalated incredibly fast, and across state lines. Women started disappearing in Washington, then down in Oregon, over to Utah, and into Colorado. He was hitting college campuses, parks, ski resorts, and you have to remember, this is the mid-1970s. Local police task forces simply did not have the technology or the infrastructure to share information across different jurisdictions easily. It was an absolute logistical nightmare. But here is the part that is just so unbelievably frustrating. Back in 1974, his name was actually handed over to the police on 2 separate occasions, once by an ex-girlfriend and once by a college buddy. Detectives brought him in, talked to him, and then let him go. Why? Because they noted he was polite, cooperative, and articulate. They just couldn't wrap their heads around the fact that this clean-cut, pre-law student could possibly be a monster. Ultimately, his first real downfall wasn't the result of some master detective work. It was a totally routine traffic stop in August 1975. A Utah Highway Patrol officer notices a VW Beetle cruising around at 2:30 in the morning with its headlights off. He pulls him over, looks inside, and finds a literal nightmare kit: a ski mask, handcuffs, rope, an ice pick, wire. He was arrested right there, and quickly picked out of a lineup by Carol DeRunch, an incredibly brave young woman who had actually fought him off with a crowbar a few months prior. Okay, moving on to part 3, the brazen escapes. Now, the justice system at the time was entirely unprepared for a guy like this, and that blind spot led to one of the darkest, most jaw-dropping chapters in criminal history, because he managed to escape custody, not once, but twice. His first escape was, honestly, almost comical. He literally just jumped out of a courthouse window in Aspen and ran. He was caught a few days later. But his second escape from Glenwood Springs? Meticulously planned. Over several months, he secretly dropped a bunch of weight, carved a hole into the ceiling of his cell, shimmied through the crawl space, threw on a stolen guard uniform, and just casually walked out the front door. Guys, it took the jail staff 17 hours to even realize he was gone.
The tragic cost of that oversight played out in Florida. Just 16 days after slipping out of that jail, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. In a span of barely 15 minutes, the violence escalated dramatically. He attacked 4 sleeping women, leaving 2 of them dead. A few weeks after that, he murdered a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach. She was his youngest confirmed victim, and her death happened just before he was finally caught in a stolen VW down in Pensacola.
This brings us to Section 4, Trials and Confessions. By 1979, the judicial process had practically become a circus. His trials were some of the very first major courtroom events to be broadcast nationally across the US, and he totally treated the whole thing like a stage for his ego. Talk about the ultimate narcissist. He fired his defense team and decided to represent himself, genuinely convinced he could just charm the jury, the judge, and the cameras. He was up there, pacing around, cross-examining expert witnesses, playing the part of the slick lawyer. He even used this bizarre legal loophole to formally marry one of his supporters, Carol Ann Boone, right there in the middle of the trial. But all that grandstanding totally blinded him to the hard evidence piling up against him. Because, at the end of the day, no amount of charisma was going to beat forensic science. The turning point was absolutely undeniable. A forensic odontologist managed to perfectly match bite marks left on victim Lisa Levy directly to his very unique teeth. After all those theatrical stunts, the jury took just 7 hours to come back with a guilty verdict on all counts.
When Judge Edward Coward handed down the death sentence, he delivered these really surreal remarks. He said, "It's a tragedy for this court to see such a waste of humanity. You'd have made a good lawyer, but you went another way, partner." I mean, it really perfectly sums up the paradox of this case, how a guy's societal privilege and clean-cut appearance managed to mask such profound darkness for so incredibly long.
After that, he sat on death row for years, constantly playing games and dodging full responsibility. It wasn't until his final days, when he was desperately trying to buy a stay of execution, that he finally started telling the truth. He sat down with FBI detective Bill Hagmaier and officially confessed to murdering 30 women across 7 different states. But honestly, the most horrifying part? We are probably never going to know the actual number. Right up until he was executed in the electric chair in 1989 at age 42, he was giving interviews trying to blame pornography for his actions, which pretty much everyone dismissed as just a cheap, last-minute excuse. And today, most investigators who worked the case agree that the real body count is likely way higher than 30. Section 5. A dark, lasting legacy. We really need to talk about the ripple effects of this case, because his terrifying ability to hide right out in the open fundamentally changed law enforcement forever.
Think about it, before him, the general assumption was that a violent killer would look, well, visibly disturbed or scary. His spree forced the FBI to totally rethink their methods. The urgent need to catch predators who look like normal guys directly accelerated the FBI behavioral science unit's work on modern criminal profiling. In fact, it's largely because of this case that the phrase serial killer even became a part of our everyday vocabulary.
It completely shattered the illusion of safety and raised some really uncomfortable questions that we're honestly still grappling with. He proved that a lethal threat can be charming, they can be educated, they can be practically invisible. How much extra time was he given simply because he didn't fit the stereotypical profile of a monster? He was flagged, brought in, and let go, entirely because of those societal biases.
Now, while it's important to study the criminology and understand the systemic failures here, we have to make sure we're centering the right people. The focus absolutely must remain on the innocent women whose lives were stolen or forever changed. Women like Karen, Linda, Janice, Denise, Margaret, Lisa, Little Kimberly, survivors like Carol DeRanche, and dozens of others. They are the true center of this narrative, not the twisted celebrity he tried to make himself out to be.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you all with a question to chew on. Do you think the fact that he was so charming makes him that much more terrifying? Or do you think our modern true crime fascination with him has maybe gone a little too far and ended up glamorizing him? Think about it, let me know where you stand, and always keep asking those hard questions about privilege, perception, and justice. Thanks for joining me, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.